Atlas had never stopped a patrol in the middle of a marked trail. Not once. Not in rain. Not in heat. Not during long training days when the forest steamed under a Carolina sun and every bootstep sank soft into red clay. But that afternoon, with the patrol moving along a ridge trail north of Camp Lejeune, the German shepherd stopped so suddenly that the whole line slowed behind him. Caleb Rowe felt the leash go still in his hand. Not tight, not pulling, just still. Atlas stood across the narrow path with his sable coat dark against the green pines, ears lifted, amber eyes fixed on the woods to the west where there was no marker, no trail sign, no reason to turn. The map said continue north. The exercise plan said reach the creek crossing by 1600 hours. The sky said hurry, because low gray clouds were sliding over the treetops and the air had begun to smell like rain pressed into bark. Caleb, a white United States Marine with close-cut light brown hair and the tired calm of a man who trusted discipline more than luck, raised one hand to halt the patrol. 3 Marines stopped behind him, boots quiet on pine needles, their packs shifting softly in the damp air. For a moment, nobody spoke. The forest did that strange thing forests do before weather changes. It listened. Caleb looked down. Atlas had lowered his nose toward the leaves, but he was not tracking like usual. His shoulders were tense. His tail stayed level. His breathing had slowed until every exhale seemed measured, careful, as if he had found something too fragile to disturb. Atlas, Caleb said quietly, forward. The dog did not move. A young Marine behind him, Lance Corporal Hayes, glanced toward the empty woods and then at the trail ahead. Sergeant, trail is this way. Caleb knew that. He knew the route, the timing, the safety boundaries, the check-in points. He also knew Atlas. This dog had crossed training fields, parking lots, creek beds, and crowded base roads without breaking command. Atlas did not stop for squirrels. He did not wander toward strange sounds. He did not make a patrol wait because the wind changed. Caleb gave the command again, softer this time. Forward. Atlas turned his head slowly, not toward the trail, but back to Caleb. That look hit him harder than a shouted warning. It was the same look Caleb had seen years earlier in a doorway half a world away, the look that said the obvious path was lying. Caleb felt the old memory rise, then settle. He unclipped the short training lead and switched to the longer tracking line. All right, he whispered. Show me what I am missing. Hayes shifted uneasily. Sergeant. Caleb did not take his eyes off Atlas. We are adjusting course. Atlas stepped off the trail into the wet leaves, slow and deliberate, nose low, ears forward. The patrol followed, leaving the safe brown line of the map behind them. Within 20 yards, the trail disappeared from sight. Within 50, the radio began to crackle with static. And somewhere deeper in the trees, carried on a thin breath of wind, came a sound so small that Caleb almost mistook it for a bird. Atlas did not. He stopped, listened, and turned farther into the woods. The moment Atlas turned deeper into the woods, Caleb felt the patrol change from training into something quieter, something nobody had planned for. The trees grew closer together off the marked route, their trunks dark with moisture, their branches combing the gray sky into narrow strips. Pine needles softened every step. Wet leaves clung to the Marine's boots. The air carried the cold smell of creek water somewhere below the ridge, mixed with earth, moss, and the faint electric scent that comes before rain. Caleb kept the tracking line loose, giving Atlas enough room to work, but not enough to vanish into the underbrush. Behind him, Lance Corporal Hayes moved carefully, one hand near his radio, his young face tight with concern. Signal is fading, Sergeant, he said. Caleb nodded without turning. Mark our path every 30 yards. Another Marine, Corporal Singh, pulled bright orange trail tape from his vest and tied a strip around a low branch. Caleb appreciated the discipline. Doubt was allowed. Sloppiness was not. Atlas continued forward, not rushing, not drifting. He moved as if following a thread only he could see, pausing at patches of mud, lifting his head when the wind shifted, then lowering his nose again. Caleb watched every change in the dog's body. A twitch of the ear, a pause in the shoulders, a slow breath through the nose. Atlas was not chasing wildlife. He was sorting the forest. Caleb had learned long ago that a German shepherd did not read the world in straight lines. Humans trusted maps because maps gave comfort. Dogs trusted scent because scent told the truth. The thought brought back a memory he rarely invited in. Years before, during a night training rotation overseas, Atlas had refused to cross a quiet courtyard. Everyone had thought the dog was tired. Caleb had almost believed it too. Then Atlas had sat down, locked his eyes on a doorway, and would not move. Minutes later, the team found the reason. Since then, Caleb had never mistaken refusal for disobedience. Not from Atlas. Not when the dog's whole body was speaking. The patrol pushed through a shallow dip where rainwater had gathered in the red clay. Atlas stepped around it, then stopped beside a fallen pine half covered in moss. He lowered one paw and scraped gently at the mud near the roots. Caleb crouched. At first he saw only leaves and brown water. Then he brushed aside a thin layer of pine needles and found a small print pressed into the clay. Not a boot print. Not military tread. A child's sneaker. Hayes knelt beside him, suddenly quiet. That is not ours. Caleb said nothing. He looked ahead into the trees, then back at Atlas. The dog was staring west again, ears forward, breathing slow. Corporal Singh tied another orange strip to a branch, but his hands had become more careful now. The exercise had ended without anyone saying it. Caleb touched the edge of the print without disturbing it, then stood and keyed his radio. Static answered first, then a broken voice from base, thin and distant. Caleb gave their approximate location, reported a possible civilian sign, and requested confirmation of any missing persons near the training boundary. The reply came in fragments, swallowed by wind and distance. Civilian campground, child reported, last seen near, yellow backpack. The transmission dissolved. Rain began to tick lightly through the canopy. Atlas lifted his head at the word nobody had fully heard, but everyone understood. Child. Caleb felt the forest grow heavier around them. He looked at his team, then at the false safety of the trail they could no longer see. We continue, he said. Atlas was already moving. Rain came slowly at first, soft enough to sound like fingertips on leaves, but the forest changed under it. Colors deepened. The red clay darkened. The bark of the pines turned almost black, and every scent lifted sharper from the ground, as if the woods had opened a hidden book only Atlas knew how to read. Caleb kept the patrol in a tight line, moving with care through the wet undergrowth. Hayes marked the route behind them with orange tape. Singh watched the left flank, quiet now, no longer questioning why they had left the trail. Nobody did. Not after the small sneaker print. Not after the broken radio message. Atlas led them down the slope toward the sound of moving water, his paws sure on the slick earth, his sable coat beaded with rain. Once, he stopped beside a patch of mountain laurel and sniffed the lower branches. Caught there, trembling in the rain, was a tiny yellow plastic charm shaped like a star. It hung from a broken key ring, the kind a child might clip to a backpack zipper because it made the ordinary feel brave. Caleb lifted it carefully between two fingers. Mud streaked one edge. The color matched the word that had come through the radio. Yellow. He held it up for the team to see. Hayes swallowed. Backpack charm. Caleb nodded and slipped it into a small evidence pouch from his field kit. We are close to the right trail. Not ours. The child's. Atlas had already moved forward again, but slower now, weaving between saplings as if the scent had thinned. The rain made everything harder. Water pulled odors down, scattered them into roots and leaves, carried them toward the creek. Caleb knew enough about tracking to respect the problem and enough about Atlas to stay out of his way. The dog paused at a fork made by deer tracks and runoff channels. One path sloped left toward easier ground. The other dropped steeply through ferns toward a narrow ravine. Atlas chose the ravine. Hayes looked at the descent. Sergeant, that is going to be rough coming back. Caleb tightened his grip on the line. Then we come back slow. They went down one at a time, using roots and branches for balance. No one rushed. The ravine held the rain like a bowl. Cold mist gathered near the ground, curling around their knees. The creek below was not wide, maybe 6 feet across, but the stones were slick and the water moved fast enough to make the crossing serious. Atlas stopped at the bank and looked upstream. His ears shifted. Caleb listened too. At first, only water. Then crows calling from somewhere beyond the ridge. Then a small sound that did not belong to weather. A faint tapping. Caleb raised his fist, and the patrol went still. Atlas stepped across the creek with careful precision, water splashing against his legs, then climbed the opposite bank and pressed his nose to the mud beneath a cedar root. There, half buried under wet leaves, was a child's yellow backpack. Caleb crouched beside it. The zipper was open. Inside were a damp snack wrapper, a small water bottle, and a folded campground map softened by rain. Hayes looked around the empty woods, voice barely above a whisper. "Where is the kid?" Atlas lifted his head before Caleb could answer. He stared uphill through the fog, body locked, not toward the trail, not toward the campground, but toward an old ridgeline where a wooden roofline barely showed through the trees. Caleb followed his gaze and saw the shape of a forgotten ranger station, gray and silent above the creek. "There," Caleb said. Atlas gave one low breath and started climbing. The climb toward the old ranger station took longer than it should have, not because it was far, but because the forest seemed determined to slow them down. Ferns brushed against their knees. Wet branches dragged across sleeves. The ground rose in uneven shelves of clay and roots, each step slick beneath the weight of rain. Atlas stayed ahead, never more than 10 feet from Caleb, his nose working low, then high, then low again. The wooden roofline appeared and disappeared through the fog, like something half-remembered. When they finally reached the ridge, the station stood in a clearing no wider than a backyard, gray with age, its porch tilted slightly, its windows clouded with dust. A faded sign near the door read "Ranger Use Only," though the letters had peeled until they looked more like a warning from another time. Caleb raised his hand, and the team spread gently around the clearing. No sudden movements. No loud voices. If a child had been there, fear could send them running deeper into the trees. Atlas approached the porch steps and stopped. He did not bark. He sniffed the first step, then the doorframe, then sat back on his haunches and looked at Caleb. That was enough. Caleb moved to the door and pushed it open. The hinges gave a tired squeal. Inside, the station smelled of damp wood, old paper, and cold ashes from a fire ring outside, blown in through gaps around the wall. Caleb swept his flashlight across the room. A metal desk, a broken chair, a shelf of outdated trail forms curled at the edges. In the corner, a child's navy blue hoodie lay crumpled on the floor, still damp. Beside it sat an empty plastic water bottle and a snack wrapper flattened carefully, as if someone had tried to make the small meal last. Hayes stepped inside behind him, voice low. "They were here." Caleb nodded. His light moved across the dusty desk, then stopped. On the surface, written with a dull pencil in uneven letters, were 4 words. "I heard a dog." For a moment, the rain seemed to fade outside. Caleb looked back at Atlas standing in the doorway, his sable coat dark with water, his amber eyes reflecting the flashlight beam. The words on the desk were not clean. They were shaky, hurried, pressed too hard in some places and barely visible in others. But they were there. A child had been alone in this forgotten place and had heard something that gave them enough hope to write it down. Singh checked the small back room and returned with a calm shake of his head. Empty. Caleb forced himself to breathe evenly. They left after writing this. Maybe followed the sound. Maybe thought help was close. Hayes tried the radio again near the doorway. Static broke apart, then a voice came through in pieces. The missing child was confirmed, 8 years old, named Noah Bennett. Last seen near a family campground just outside the training boundary. Search teams were moving from the south, but fog was slowing visibility. Caleb keyed his radio. "We found signs at an old ranger station north of the creek. Child is no longer inside. K9 has active direction." The reply dissolved before he heard confirmation. Atlas suddenly turned from the doorway and moved to the back of the station. He pressed his nose against a warped lower panel, then pushed through a gap where the wood had split away from the frame. Caleb followed him outside into a narrow strip of weeds behind the building. The rain had softened the soil there, and in the mud were 2 small sneaker prints pointing downhill. Atlas looked over the slope, body still, ears forward. Below them, hidden by fog and trees, the creek bent sharply around a cluster of fallen logs. Caleb felt the truth settle cold and clear. Noah had not gone back toward the campground. He had gone toward the water. Caleb tightened the tracking line, glanced at his team, and said, "We move now." They descended from the ranger station into a world made smaller by fog. The trees below the ridge blurred into pale columns, and the creek sounded closer than it looked. its water moving over stone with a steady cold murmur. Caleb kept one hand on the tracking line and the other slightly raised, signaling the patrol to slow their steps. This was no longer about speed. Speed could miss things. Speed could frighten a lost child who had already spent too many hours listening to rain and shadows. Atlas moved with a patience that felt almost holy. He did not charge downhill. He placed each paw carefully, nose skimming the wet leaves, then lifting whenever the wind curled up from the creek. Every few yards, he paused and looked back at Caleb, not for permission, but to make sure the humans were still following the thread. Hayes breathed hard behind him, young lungs working against the climb and the worry. Singh tied another orange strip around a branch, then checked the compass clipped to his vest. "We are northwest of the original route," he said quietly. "Almost half a mile." Caleb did not answer at first. He watched Atlas step around a cluster of exposed roots and stop beside a low patch of mud beneath a holly bush. There, pressed shallow into the softened ground, was another child's sneaker print, turned sideways, as if Noah had paused and changed his mind. Next to it was the drag mark of a stick, or maybe a small branch used for balance. Caleb crouched, touching nothing. He was tired here, he said. The words hung in the damp air. Not hopeless, not final, just true. Hayes looked toward the creek. Search teams are coming from the south. If he heard them, he might have tried to reach the water. Caleb looked at Atlas. The dog had gone still again. His ears were not aimed at the creek now. They were aimed beyond it, toward the bend where the water disappeared behind fallen trees. Rain slid from his muzzle in clear drops. His amber eyes did not blink. Then he gave one low breath and moved forward. The ground steepened near the creek bank, and Caleb signaled the team to spread just enough to maintain footing. The water below was only knee-deep in places, but the stones were slick and the current gathered speed around the bend. Caleb kept his voice low and calm. "Noah," he called. "My name is Caleb. I am here with Marines and a search dog. If you can hear me, stay where you are." Only the creek answered. Atlas crossed a narrow shelf of mud near the bank, then stopped so abruptly Caleb almost stepped into him. The German shepherd lowered his body, not pointing forward now, but downward, toward a cluster of fallen logs wedged against the far side of the bend. Caleb followed his line of sight and saw nothing at first. Brown leaves, wet bark, gray stone, then a small piece of blue fabric moved beneath the shadow of the largest log. Caleb's heart tightened. "Noah," he said again, softer now. From across the water came the faintest reply, almost swallowed by fog. "Dog." Atlas lifted his head. Caleb felt the whole patrol go still behind him. "Yes," Caleb answered, his voice steady though his throat had gone dry. "The dog is here. His name is Atlas." A pause. Then the small voice came again, shaking but awake. "I heard him before." Caleb looked down at Atlas, and for one breath, the forest seemed to become silent around them. The trail had been wrong. The map had been incomplete. But Atlas had heard the child long before any of them understood what the mission had become. Caleb raised his hand, keeping the patrol still, then lowered his voice toward the creek bend, as if speaking too loudly might scare the small hope hiding there. "Noah, listen to me. Stay exactly where you are. We are coming to you." Across the water, beneath the dark shape of the fallen logs, the blue fabric shifted again. Not much, just enough to show that the child had heard him. Atlas remained low beside Caleb, chest nearly touching the wet leaves, eyes fixed on the far bank with a steadiness that seemed to hold the whole forest in place. Caleb unclipped a small light from his vest and set it on the ground, angling the beam toward himself instead of Noah, so the child could see a calm face and not just shadows moving through fog. "This is Atlas," Caleb said gently. "He found your backpack. He found the ranger station. He brought us here." There was a pause. Then Noah's thin voice answered. "I tried to follow the barking." Caleb looked at Atlas. The German shepherd had not barked since leaving the trail. Maybe Noah had heard another search dog far away. Maybe sound had carried strangely through the ravine. Or maybe, in the lonely hours before help arrived, hope had taken the shape of whatever a frightened child needed most. Caleb did not correct him. "You did the right thing by stopping," he said. "Now let us do the walking." Singh moved to the left, studying the creek for a safe crossing. Hayes radioed their position, repeating it twice through heavy static until a broken confirmation came back. Other search teams were redirecting toward the creek bend. Emergency medical help was on the way, but the woods and weather would slow them down. Caleb could not wait for perfect conditions. He scanned the water, the stones, the fallen logs, and the narrow strip of mud where Noah had tucked himself out of the rain. The creek was not deep, but it was cold, fast enough to steal balance, and the child was too tired to cross alone. Caleb pointed to a shallow line of stones downstream. "We cross there. Slow. One at a time." Atlas rose at the command before Caleb spoke it. He stepped into the creek first, placing his paws with careful certainty, water curling around his legs. Caleb followed, boots slipping once before catching against a flat stone. The cold pushed through the leather almost immediately. Hayes and Singh held position on the near bank, ready with a thermal blanket and rope line from the field kit. Atlas reached the far side, shook once, then walked toward Noah without crowding him. He did not bark. He did not leap. He simply lowered himself to the ground a few feet away, making his large body small, his head level with the child's eyes. Noah was 8 years old, wrapped in his damp blue hoodie, knees drawn close, cheeks pale from the cold and streaked with rainwater and mud. He stared at Atlas first, not Caleb. "Is he nice?" Noah whispered. Caleb knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible. "He is the best Marine I know." Atlas gave a soft breath through his nose, and Noah's fingers reached out, trembling, until they touched the wet fur between the dog's ears. The moment his hand landed there, his face changed. Fear did not disappear, but it loosened. Caleb slid his own jacket from his shoulders and wrapped it around Noah, then checked him with the practiced care of someone who knew the difference between urgent and panicked. "You are safe now," he said. "We are going to get you warm, and we are going to take you back to your family." Noah kept one hand on Atlas. "I thought nobody knew where I was." Caleb looked at the dog, rain shining along his sable coat. Someone knew enough to turn around. Getting Noah back across the creek took patience, and patience was exactly what the forest demanded. Caleb did not rush him. Hayes and Singh secured the rope line between two sturdy trunks, then guided it across the shallow bend, while Atlas stayed beside Noah like a living anchor. The boy's fingers remained tangled in the dog's wet fur, not gripping hard, just holding on the way people hold a porch rail in the dark. Caleb wrapped the jacket tighter around Noah's shoulders and spoke in the same low voice he used with young Marines on their first hard night in the field. "One step at a time. You watch Atlas. We will handle the rest." Noah nodded, though his chin trembled from the cold. Atlas stood first, slow and careful, then took one step toward the water and looked back. The boy followed because the dog had made the impossible feel ordinary. Caleb moved on Noah's other side, one hand steadying the child's elbow, the other holding the line. The creek pressed cold around their boots. Rain tapped the surface in tiny silver rings. Halfway across, Noah stopped, breathing fast, eyes fixed on the moving water. Atlas immediately turned and pressed his shoulder lightly against the boy's knees. Not pushing, not pulling, just there. Noah looked down at him, swallowed, and took another step. When they reached the near bank, Hayes wrapped Noah in the thermal blanket, and Singh knelt to check his pack for dry supplies. Caleb kept scanning the trees, listening as distant voices began to carry through the fog. Search teams. Closer now. The mission had widened around them, but the center of it remained small. One child, one dog, one choice to leave the trail. Noah sat on a flat stone beneath a cedar, wrapped in silver, with Atlas lying beside him and resting his head near the boy's knee. "I thought I was going the right way," Noah said after a while. Caleb crouched in front of him. "A lot of people think that when they are scared." Noah blinked toward the ridge. "I heard a dog from far away. I thought maybe someone was looking for me, so I went toward it. Then I got tired." His voice broke softly, but there was no shame in it. Caleb nodded. Stopping was smart. Noah looked at Atlas. Did he really hear me? Caleb followed the line of Atlas's body, the wet fur, the calm eyes, the ears still listening even after the rescue. He heard something the rest of us missed. The first search volunteer appeared through the trees with a flashlight, followed by 2 county responders in rain jackets. Relief moved through the group quietly, not as cheering, but as hands on shoulders, careful questions, warm blankets, and voices saying Noah's name like returning it to the world. A responder radioed that the child had been found safe. Somewhere through the static, a woman cried out, and even though the sound was broken by distance, everyone understood it. Caleb stepped back then, letting the medics work, and for the first time since Atlas had stopped on the trail, he looked toward where they had come from. The marked route was somewhere beyond the ridge, invisible now. It had been correct on paper, safe on paper, reasonable on paper, but paper had not known about a yellow star charm in the mud, a blue hoodie in an empty ranger station, or a boy waiting by a creek with one last piece of hope shaped like a dog's voice. Atlas rose and came to Caleb's side. Rain ran down both of them. Caleb rested his hand on the shepherd's head, not as praise, but as thanks. "You changed the mission," he whispered. Atlas looked back into the fog, still listening. The walk back from the creek became slower than the search, but no one complained. Noah was carried part of the way by a county responder, wrapped in dry blankets now. His small face turned toward Atlas whenever the dog came into view. The rain softened to mist, and the fog lifted in thin layers from the ground, revealing the orange trail markers Hayes had tied along the branches like small flames leading them home. Caleb walked near the front with Atlas at his side, while Singh guided the rear of the group and kept count every few minutes. The forest no longer felt like a maze. It felt like a place releasing what it had been holding. At the old ranger station, the team paused so responders could check Noah again and gather the hoodie, the backpack, and the yellow star charm Caleb had protected in his pouch. The pencil words still sat on the dusty desk. "I heard a dog." A county responder stood over them for a moment, silent beneath the brim of his rain hood. "He wrote that before we were anywhere close," the man said. Caleb looked at Atlas, who stood in the doorway, water dripping from his sable coat onto the worn floorboards. "Atlas was close enough," Caleb answered. No one argued. Outside, the first break in the clouds opened above the ridge, a pale strip of evening light spreading behind the pines. They moved again, climbing toward the original trail with the careful rhythm of tired people carrying something precious. When they finally reached the marked path, the difference was almost startling. The trail looked clean, simple, harmless, a brown ribbon through trees that seemed to promise certainty. Caleb stopped there and looked north, toward the direction they had been supposed to go hours earlier. If Atlas had obeyed, they would have reached the creek crossing on time. The training report would have been clean. The map would have looked correct. And Noah would have remained far below the ridge, too quiet for men walking the proper route to hear. Hayes came to stand beside Caleb, his young face changed by the day. "I thought he was throwing us off schedule," he admitted. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail. "So did I for a second." Hayes looked down at Atlas. "How did he know?" Caleb let the question breathe. Wind moved through the wet needles overhead. Far away, a vehicle door closed at the trailhead, and voices called Noah's name with a hope that had finally found its answer. "He listened longer than we did," Caleb said. That was the only explanation that felt true. At the trailhead, floodlights from search vehicles washed the gravel in white and gold. Noah's mother reached him before anyone could stop her, dropping to her knees beside the responder who carried him, wrapping her arms around the blankets with a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Caleb looked away, giving them that private second, but Atlas watched calmly, as if he had been waiting for the circle to close. Then Noah lifted one hand from the blanket and pointed toward the German shepherd. His mother turned, eyes wet, and whispered, "Is that him?" Noah nodded. Caleb walked Atlas closer. The boy reached out and touched the dog's working collar with careful fingers. Atlas stood perfectly still, not proud, not restless, just present. Noah's mother looked up at Caleb, trying to speak, but gratitude caught before it became words. Caleb understood. Some things were too heavy for language. He simply nodded, then rested his hand on Atlas's head. Behind them, the trail disappeared into the dark woods, still marked, still correct, still incomplete. In front of them, a child was safe. A mother was breathing again, and a dog who had turned away from the path had led everyone back to what mattered. By the time the last search vehicle left the trailhead, the rain had stopped completely. The gravel lot shone under the floodlights, every puddle holding a small broken reflection of the sky. Noah was already on his way to the hospital for a careful check, wrapped warm beside his mother, still holding the yellow star charm Caleb had returned to him. The other Marines loaded their gear in silence, the kind that comes after a long mission when everyone understands more than they are ready to say. Hayes stood near the tailgate, looking at Atlas as the German shepherd drank from a metal bowl, calm as if he had only completed another ordinary drill. "Sergeant," Hayes said quietly, "I do not think I will ever look at a trail the same way again." Caleb closed his pack and looked toward the dark tree line. The marked path began there, clean and official, with a wooden sign, a mileage number, and a map box mounted beside it. It had not lied on purpose. It simply had not known enough. "A trail tells you where people usually go," Caleb said. "It does not always tell you where someone needs you." Hayes nodded, carrying that sentence somewhere deeper than memory. Later, after the reports were filed and the team returned to base, Caleb walked Atlas past the quiet kennels instead of taking him straight inside. The night air smelled of wet pine, diesel, and cooling earth. Somewhere beyond the fence, the woods had gone still again, holding their darkness without threat now. Caleb stopped near the training field where the patrol had started hours earlier. He could almost see the moment again, Atlas standing across the path, refusing to move, the whole day balanced on one impossible pause. Caleb knelt and unclipped the working line from Atlas's collar. "You knew," he said softly. Atlas looked at him with those steady amber eyes, rain still drying along the edges of his sable fur. Caleb had spent much of his life believing duty meant staying on the assigned road, keeping formation, completing the plan exactly as written. And most days, that was true. But not every life in need waits beside a marked route. Not every call for help arrives clearly through a radio. Sometimes it comes on the wind, hidden beneath rain, carried through leaves, trusted first by a creature with no rank, no map, and no need for proof. Caleb rested his hand on Atlas's head. This time he did say it, low and simple. "Good dog." Atlas leaned into him for one brief second, then turned his gaze back toward the trees, still listening, still ready. Caleb stood beside him and let the silence settle. Somewhere, a child was warm. Somewhere, a mother was breathing easier. And in the quiet between the base lights and the dark woods, Caleb understood that mercy often begins the moment someone brave enough turns around.